Now as we come to verse 6, 7, 8, as this narrative gets even more intense, the outflow of this, the use of vayikach several times in verse 6 highlights Abraham, again, faithfully following God's instruction. He takes several times the various items, and sometimes, of course, it involves the role of Isaac. And then, of course, we have in verse 7 and flowing over into the beginning of verse 8, the multiple uses of vayomer. Again, these terse statements, very, very brief. Sometimes the vayomer is simply one word, followed by one word, avi, or two words, hineni beni. And then it expands. So you have a vayomer followed by the 3 to 4 words, beginning of verse 7, then you have 1, then 2, and then multiple words in the end of 7 and in verse 8. So this is another way of intensifying the narrative. You notice how I have laid out the text in verse 7 of the Hebrew with this kind of chiastic structure that is the center point of Abraham saying, "Behold my son," which is very effective if you think about it from a Christocentric God saying, "Behold my son, who I'm now pleased," at the baptism of Jesus. But so the instruction in verse 6, Abraham took again the wood for the burnt offering, and then he put it upon Isaac his son. So now we have again twofold, Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the ma'akelet. If you look at word that's often translated knife or dagger, built off the word akal, which is the verb for eating. In the ancient world, in eating a burnt offering, a sacrifice of meat, you ate with a knife. Your instrument of eating is a knife. So that's how. So the main preposition, main performative here. Now it's built off the participial form of akal, is an instrument for eating. And again, that's when we talk about Hebrew morphology, how words are formed. It's one of the common ways is to have a main prefix to an item, a verb, making it a kind of, in this case, a feminine singular morphological form built off the participle. The instrument of eating is a knife. And the same in the next part. So he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and the two of them go off together, yakdav. So then they're on the journey up toward the particular location on Mount Moriah that Isaac begins to ask. He asks of his father, and he says, Avi, my father. Father says, behold, I am here, my son. And then he says, behold the fire, the wood. Here's what we need for a burnt offering. But, aye, where is haseh, the lamb, the ram, the offering for this burnt offering? And Abraham says, God will see to it. Again, reflecting upon the aspect of they go together up in verse 5. God's going to make a way. God's going to see to whatever regarding, again, Hasei Olah Beni, regarding the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them continue on together. So again, the repetition here that's highlighted, the two of them go, the last line of verse 6 and the last line of verse 7, they continue the journey. So Isaac is questioning the situation, but he is all the way through though without knowing the details, Abraham is relaying to his son an important message to his son. God is the one who provides the answers to the questions of life. So then, verse 9, as we continue this work through the narrative, finally they come to, bo is often used to entering into a land or entering into a household. So they come to the particular place which God had said to him. Again, reiterating the instructions of the previous portions of the narrative. And there he begins to prepare. He builds there a Hazmasbeach, builds an altar. And again, notice, the rapid sequence of these Vav consecutive forms throughout the multiple Vayomers of verses 7 and 8. Now, quickly, the narrator outlines the preparation for this carrying out of divine instruction to be willing to sacrifice his son. So, they go to the place of God's instruction. Abraham builds there an altar. He arranges the wood. So now the narration is slowing down as he does each part. Ya'arok, by the way, just to remind you, as he prepares the wood, is that same verb, arok, that we find in Psalm 23. God prepares a table before us in the presence of our enemies. Arok, so he arranges in a special way. Again, the customary way of performing a burnt offering with the wood. And then we have the binding of Isaac. So we had, again, before, the wood for the burnt offering was bound, a cord, on the back of Isaac. Now Isaac is bound and he is placed upon the altar by Yasem, Oto, Hamasbeach, Mim Ma'al, from on top of the wood that has been laid out in proper order. Verse 9. Succession of Vav consecutive forms, most of them cows, and then the climax. Then Abraham, now we're slowing down, he stretches forth Vayishlach et Yado, his hand. Now, note again, Vayikach, he took. So he's taken a lot of things on the journey. Now he takes that instrument of eating, the knife, the dagger, in order to, here the lamed of purpose, in order to shakot, to slaughter, a term used in the ritual slaughtering of a sacrifice. So he stretches forth his hand, he takes the knife as he's stretching forth his hand with the purpose of sacrificing his son. So he's following step by step God's command to carry out the details that are involved of performing this most difficult task of sacrificing his son. And then God intervenes. On the cusp of the moment, as his hand is extended over his son, that God calls out to him through his special messenger. Vayikra elav malach Adonai min hashemayim. So the messenger of God, the divine angel of the Lord, we often translate it. The divine messenger calls out to him from the heavens, and he says, not once now, but twice, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham responds, Hineni, as he has done in several previous occasions. God calls out from the heavens as his hand is stretched forth with the purpose of sacrificing, of slaughtering his son. And God says through his messenger, verse 12, Al Tishlach, strong negative plus the imperfect. All plus the imperfect is the strong negative of Hebrew narrative, the equivalent of a very strong imperative. Do not stretch forth your hand, duplicating the terminology of the first part of verse 10, stretching forth of the hand. And then he says, do not stretch out your hand to the young man, and do not ta'as do to him ma'uma, anything, nothing at all. Do not do anything at all to him. For ata yadati ki yireh Elohim ata. Lord says, now I know for sure that a fear of God, Yireh Elohim. Again, I talked earlier about submission to God's will. The ultimate expression of fearing God is to be willing to humbly, faithfully carry out God's will, to carry out his instruction of his word. He says, now I know that you, a fear of God are you, a faithful follower, a faithful, humbly in submission follower of God are you. And that you are not unwilling, you might say, with regard to your son, your only one from me. You would not withhold. To give me back your son, you are not reticent about completing the divine task. You would not withhold your son from me. Your son, again, that term, the repetition of Yehidakah, your unique, special son, Isaac. You have been faithfully following my instruction, and now I know by your exemplary, expressed, demonstrated faith that you are a fearer of God. And as that revelatory word from God has come, he simply lifts up his eyes again, like he lifted up his eyes to the hill, to the place as he saw it from afar. He lifts up his eyes, and behold, he looked again, a use of ra'ah, to see with a divine perspective. Behold, an isle, achar, on the back of this bush, with his horns stuck there within. So again, you recall these imagery, and you could pull up images online of these various types of wild animals, such as the ibex, who extend up to feed off the branches of an acacia tree or some other tree, the new budding leaves off the branches of a tree. Been up in the hiking in the wildernesses around the Judean desert and the desert of the territory of Benjamin, where these wild ibex feed off these trees. But here we have one whose horns are stuck in the bush, in the savak, on the back of the bush. And Abraham sees that which he has been divinely enabled to see, as God has brought the eyes of Abraham and the ram of the sacrifice together in this divinely ordained revelatory moment. And Abraham went, and again, vayikach, he took the ayil, the ram, and he offered up it, Hifil imperfect, 5 consecutive, for a burnt offering, and olah, tachat beno, in place of his son. So he is enabled to see, as he has said, God will see to it, as he told Isaac, questioning about the item for the sacrifice. Now he fully sees. So again, this repetitious use of ra'ah, to see that which God has divinely provided. He is enabled to see. He's had divine revelatory instruction not to complete that which God had instructed him to do, but God would provide, and therefore to take. There's a unique use of lakak that I did a paper for a number of years back in a presentation. The use of lakak in revelatory moments or in priestly activity. Unique ways that lakak can mean to take or receive, just any item, but there are a number of times that lakak is used in special, in this case, Abraham as the priest of his family at this point, as would typically happen, carries out a divine sacrificial act, taking the instruments, performing the sacrifice as he then takes the ayil, the ram, for the burnt offering. So, as we conclude this narrative, in verse 14 and following, we have Vayikra again. Now, Abraham, as a result, though the conclusion, we often have the naming of a place in these divine narratives, like we have the Be'er Lahai-Roi, the well of Lahai-Roi, where the living is seen. Now the place is called Adonai Yireh. God sees, God provides. God sees to the accomplishment of his task. He provided that which was necessary, and hence it was that it was said that day that Yahweh saw to this special provision in place of Isaac, the substitutionary sacrifice, so that the life of his son would continue. So then we have verse 15, another Vayikra. The angel of the Lord, the messenger of the Lord, called out to Abraham a second time. Again, he called out to Abraham from heaven not to slaughter his son as a sacrifice and extend his hand with the knife in hand over his son, but now calls out to him a second time from heaven. And he said to him, now, by myself I am swearing, oracle of Yahweh. That phraseology, Ne'um Adonai, Ne'um Yahweh, is most often found in prophetic messages, as often concludes a divine oracle, often judgment oracles, like in Isaiah and Jeremiah. I think probably the largest number of occurrences of Ne'um Adonai is in the book of Jeremiah, and then numerous number of divine oracles. But now, the oracle of Yahweh, such that it was, you have done this thing that I required of you, that you've not withheld your son, your only one, from me. So as a result, verses 17 and following will conclude at this point. The blessing is reiterated. Barek avarecha. And remember the infinitive absolute form followed by the imperfect form. I will surely bless you. And then similarly with the verb ravah, the hifil, infinitive absolute followed by the imperfect form of the ravah, again first person, and I will multiply your seed through the son whom I've delivered from death with his substitutionary sacrifice. I will bring blessing to your descendants, and such that they will be as numerous as the stars of the heavens, and like the sand which is upon the shore of the sea. Thus, the promised inheritance divinely provided for the descendants, the seed of Abraham and Isaac. Sha'ar oiveh. Even in the context of the world, of the nations, God is going to open up that door of his blessing upon the nations for eternity, that through a substitutionary sacrifice, as he did in the ultimate fulfillment of this divine type of God's patterns of working in history. The term typology, like the theologian Edmund Yaakov's use of typology, he said, are the patterns of God's consistent working throughout history. The patterns by which he reveals himself are consistent revelatory patterns of the way God works in, through, and on behalf of his people, especially those who are faithful, as Paul says in Romans, and called according to his purpose, that God works all things for the ultimate good to those who are faithfully, those who are called according to his purposes. And that promise starts out here with Abraham's faithfully following God's call, the willingness to give up all to follow the divine instruction, to receive the ultimate in blessing. For Abraham to have failed to carry out God's instruction, unimaginable. But the revelation of instruction that comes forth, and hence Abraham, of course, would be the exemplar of faith, as we see later as he is described in the book of Hebrews and in numerous other places throughout the New Testament.